Joining us now on this show is Salvatore Babones, Associate Professor at the University of Sydney. Right off the bat, Mr. Babones, what do you make of the comments by George Soros?
Well, it's kind of funny to hear them because George Soros has a history of undermining the rule of law in countries around the world, including in my own home country, the United States. So to hear him talking about democracy in India in a day of reckoning is a bit rich for someone who, although he believes in open society, he runs a foundation called the Open Society Foundation. He doesn't necessarily believe in democracy, at least not in the sense that ordinary people mean it, that the people should govern themselves.
Interesting is that he seems to think that the Adani saga will weaken Mr. Modi's stranglehold on the federal government and bring in institutional reforms. What do you make of these institutional reforms that a businessman wants to see in India?
First thing to remember is that Mr. Modi doesn't have a quote-unquote stranglehold on the Indian government. Mr. Modi is the elected Prime Minister of India, and that gives him the authority to act as the head of government in India. Broadly, George Soros is himself, or made his fortune, I should say, as a professional short seller that is in the same business, or was before he retired, as Hindenburg is. And he sees the same sort of opportunities they do. Let's remember, the Adani share price has fallen really just back 1 year. It's right now at the same place it was this time a year ago. That's not really catastrophic in the scheme of things. A lot of people would have thought that the Adani share price was overvalued. I'm not an investment advisor. I can't tell you whether it was overvalued or undervalued, but it run up a lot in 1 year. And to go back to where it was a year ago, it's hardly a catastrophe. Certainly, it doesn't say much about corporate governance. Now, corporate governance in India is a perpetual question because India does have an open judicial system. It has a free and fair politics, and as a result, when questions arise about corporate governance, they're pursued. That's not the case in most countries that have a GDP per capita of $2,200 or $2,400 per year. So in a way, the fact that we're actually talking about the Adani saga is itself evidence of a robust corporate governance in India, certainly as compared to other countries, other peer countries of India at the same level of development.
Within India, this is being seen, at least by the government, as an attempt at regime change. Do you agree with that interpretation, or that's a bit of a leap?
I think it's fair to call it an attempt at regime change, as long as you emphasize the word attempt. It's clear that George Soros would like to see regime change in India. That doesn't mean that it will actually happen, or that he's making any practical motion towards having that happen. Soros is thoroughly opposed not only to the Modi government in India, but to conservative governments and traditional governments around the world. That much is clear. This really just isn't such a big issue. I have to be honest, I'm flabbergasted that this saga has become a saga. I mean, after all, if we look at American capitalism, Google was fined $2.5 billion last month for misbehavior, for breaking European Union antitrust laws. And we shrug that off. That's just the cost of doing business. In many ways, what we're seeing coming out in these Adani revelations is just the ordinary tussle of doing business in a developing country in a tough environment. Now, whether anything illegal has been done, I can't tell you. That'll be left to the prosecutors. The important point for me as a student of Indian democracy is that India has those prosecutors, that India has those governance institutions that will form a check against capitalism gone awry.
Now, as an ordinary citizen,
it's what gives him the power to decide. I mean, he's had a seriously deleterious effect on crime, for example, in the United States, where he's supported all across the countries prosecutors who take a will not prosecute approach to street crime. And as a result, we've seen a massive resurgence, all in the name of what he calls open society. Now, that's not what American voters want, and I think those prosecutors will be thrown out at the next election. But he's been very influential because he's willing to spend his vast fortune in order to influence politics. And when he spends that fortune in developing countries, it has an outsized influence. I mean, if he's having an influence even in the United States, which is such a massive country with a massive economy, imagine the kind of influence he can have in poor and developing countries.
Now, In the past, of course, Mr. Soros has been interviewed. There are viral clips of him saying that essentially he's an amoral businessman. Do you think that his main problem with India would be that he is not finding a condition which allows him to function amorally the way he would want to? Is that the real issue?
I doubt that's the case. My understanding is that he's mostly retired at this point. I don't know that for sure, but he certainly spends most of his time on shepherding his pet causes through the Open Society Foundation. And I should be clear, many of those causes are very good causes. The Open Society Foundation supports a lot of important work around the world. The problem is that it supports work that idiosyncratically reflects the politics and the preferences of one man. And those preferences sometimes are in line with basically good public policy for everyone, and sometimes are at odds with the proper and smooth functioning of democratic institutions of appropriate. In this case, it seems to me that he is speaking where he really has no business to intrude. He seems to have a visceral dislike for the Modi government, and he seems to be letting that drive his politics here, instead of asking for basic reforms. I mean, in many other countries, George Soros funds very basic reforms along the lines of training, technical training for accountancy bodies. Well, that's a good thing. I am not an opponent of George Soros or his foundation. I do think, however, that he throws his money around and throws his weight around in ways that are sometimes inappropriate.
In fact, some of his work and that of the Open Society Foundation also relates to topics that you've spoken very passionately about. For example, Freedom House in 2019 downgraded India from free to partly free. And now we found that among the donor partners for Freedom House is Mr. George Soros. Should we see a link there?
I don't think so. Freedom House is a quality, objective organization that I think has problems with its democracy ratings, but I don't think it's as simple as George Soros telling Freedom House to downgrade India. It's nothing like that at all. George Soros funds Freedom House because he believes in their mission. And the people at Freedom House have downgraded India because India's current politics are at odds with the political preferences of the expert panel who serve on Freedom House. I really encourage people to see this more at a class level than at an individual action level. The kinds of people who apply for George Soros funding, Freedom House, the kinds of people who serve as expert advisors at Freedom House, intellectuals and political scientists and seen at top-level institutions, those kinds of people tend to be opposed to conservative governments and religiously conservative governments, not only in India, but around the world. It's not just India that has this battle with the Open Society Foundation and with Freedom House. So I think this is a matter of the attitudes of a whole class of people, not the money of George Soros in particular. Where George Soros matters is that he provides the funding for this point of view to be preferenced above other equally legitimate points of view.
Now, also, the US media watchdog Media Research Center had alleged that Soros enjoys enormous influence in the media and has ties to more than 30 mainstream news outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, CNN, and ABC. Now, can we expect then, given Mr. Soros's view about India, an objective reporting on India by these outlets?
Again, I don't think the two are necessarily connected. They're connected at a broader systemic level. That is, George Soros funds the kinds of journalism of which he approves. And the people of which he approves have similar attitudes towards him. So he's not outright buying their opinions. It's not that the mainstream media in the United States are reporting negatively on India because George Soros has negative opinions about India. It's that he is funding an ecosystem that shares his point of view. And that point of view is opposed not only to India's current, but is opposed, as I said, to conservative and particularly to traditionalist, religiously traditionalist politics all around the world.
Now, one thing is about funding and the other is about collaboration, because today in India, actively the debate is about how there could be political collaborators of people like Mr. Soros in this regime change operation, basically trying to get Mr. Modi out. Do you think that that is a possibility or it's a conspiracy theory?
At this point, I think we have to call that a conspiracy theory, and not a conspiracy theory that's likely to turn out true. Of course, I can't know what's being done in secret, but George Soros' way of operating is not to secretly fund political opposition somehow through black money. His way of operating is to openly and publicly boost the side of an issue with which he agrees. And we all do that. There's really, at a fundamental level, there's not which he's spending his money. Those people have much less access to resources than George Soros' billions. As a result, he's privileging a certain point of view by throwing around his weight, effectively throwing around his money to support the propagation of that point of view. It's not the same as spending money to get rid of a government. Instead, it's building an infrastructure, building an ecosystem. He wants to build a network of organizations that are not explicitly there to oppose Mr. Modi or the BJP, but they're mostly consist of people who are inherently opposed to the current government of India. So it's not as simple as a regime change or a coup d'etat or a conspiracy to overthrow the Indian government. Instead, it's a long-term patient effort to build the infrastructure of a web of organizations that share a Soros point of view.
Speaking of people who are inherently anti-Modi, you had once said that Indian intellectuals are anti-Indian as a class. Do you think that this circle had a role to play in what Indian ministers today have claimed as an attempt to target India at the behest of Mr. Soros?
Well, thank you for adding that as a class, which is something I would like to make sure everyone is clear on. I'm not accusing individual Indian intellectuals of being anti-national or anything like that. But as a group, they are taking their own political agenda in India and weaponizing that internationally. That is, instead of saying, I don't like the current government of India, they're telling international audiences, India itself is no longer a democracy. Now, that kind of hyperbole, but when you say Indian intellectuals are, as a class, anti-Indian, I'm not saying they're not patriotic and they don't have a national loyalty. I'm saying that through their actions, they're undermining the state when they should be opposing the government.
And in undermining the state, are they playing into the hands of George Soros, maybe deliberately or unwittingly?
It's not that they're playing into the hands of George Soros, it's that George Soros wants to support what they are doing. That is, George Soros is very supportive with his money and very generous with his money of the intellectual class, the liberal secular intellectual class around the world. He certainly does not support conservative or traditionalist intellectuals anywhere in the world. And again, that simply tilts the playing field. It's not that India's intellectuals are somehow beholden to George Soros, but when they look for a grant, when a news organization, an independent media outlet in India looks for a grant, and that outlet is thoroughly opposed to the current government of India, they're going to find a willing ear in the likes of George Soros.
Almost like a match made in heaven. Now, within the last few months, we have seen, of course, the BBC documentary talking about Mr. Modi despite a Supreme Court judgment. Then we had yesterday a report that spoke of how an Israeli group, a shadowy group, is being used perhaps in India to try and rig elections. And now we had the statement of intent, as it were, from George Soros. Should one connect those dots? An anti-India campaign?
No, those are absolutely not connected dots. They may be some kind of marriage of convenience, but they're certainly not a blow with opposition to Rishi Sunak and being the first Hindu prime minister and the first Indian origin prime minister of the UK. It has much more to do with that than it has to do with Indian politics. The Israeli case is still very obscure. I don't know what's going on with that. So these things are not really connected. Now, they may all point in the same direction, but if they do so, it's because all of these disparate groups have the same visceral dislike for the sorts of politics that Mr. Modi and the BJP stand for. There's nothing wrong with opposing Mr. Modi and the BJP. Each of these groups has their own reasons for being opposed to Mr. Modi. But the fact that they line up doesn't indicate that they're actually working together in any way.
But what do you think explains this visceral dislike for Mr. Modi? For people as disparate as a businessman or, whatever shadowy figures are working in the UK, what explains it?
I think it's fair to say that Mr. Modi and the BJP he leads have been historically themselves anti-intellectual. They have ridiculed and strongly opposed what they call Boynton's Deli, the Con Market Gang, JNU. So this battle is not a one-way street. I mean, both sides are opposed to each other, and it's no surprise that when intellectuals feel vilified by the BJP, excluded from power, when previous governments have always turned to the same group of English-speaking, Western-educated intellectuals for guidance, but then in 2014, Mr. Modi and the BJP changed to a new set of advisors. It's no surprise that old set of advisors, that the historical intellectual class of India, what I call in my work the comprador elite of India, it's no surprise that they would, in response, turn against the government that has cut off their pay and cut off their influence.
Final question. Do you think this is basically the rambling of somebody who dreams of having greater influence over India, or should one really be worried about what George Soros said, given his history with other countries?
Remember, India is a democracy, and ultimately India's governments are going to be determined at the voting booth, not by elite discourses. Our English language discourse hardly matters when it comes to Indian elections, and no or very, very few Indians are going to be persuaded in their vote by what Mr. Soros says about India. Similarly, any investigation of Adani is not going to happen because George Soros calls for it. If Adani has done anything illegal, it'll be prosecuted by India's prosecution services and at both the state and at the national level. And that's how it should be. Let's not put too much weight on what one outspoken billionaire has to say about Indian politics. India will do just fine on its own.
Well, let's certainly end on that fond hope. Thank you very much, Mr. Salvatore Babones, for taking out time during your very hectic India trip to speak to Times Now.